you very much for that stunning and actually reminding me how long it is that I've been doing this job introduction, and thank you to both of you for the opportunity to present this lunchtime, and thank you to you for coming. Nomenclature. Just to start with a moment. Conflict archaeology in Burma, I will also be referring to Myanmar. Those of you who are aware of the semantics and politics of the area will know that the terms are not synonymous. If you know anything about it, for the great majority of people they are synonymous. And certainly in Britain I've used Burma in my title because, well, that's the term that most people in Britain use, and I've used Myanmar in the presentation because we were guests of the government. Without them, we wouldn't have got to do any digging. That's what they call their country. Some other people, including a lady who you'll see photographs of later, call it something else, but that's why there's both terms used. I work for WYG, as you heard. We're a multidisciplinary environmental engineering and construction and planning consultancy, in the same mould as the Atkins, CGMS kind of people. I am half of the archaeology team, and we provide expert heritage services for clients. That may be residential build supermarkets, that kind of thing. And a lot of my work, yesterday I was out looking at a solar farm in Somerset. It involves doing the pre-checks on the site, assessing the evidence for previous archaeology, and then commissioning and sometimes undertaking field work. Essentially, that's what I'm going to talk about today. It's the same as the rest of the day job. I'll talk about working overseas, our partnerships with the people in country. How? Because it's a different place. There are different cultural awarenesses to working in Somerset. Strange as Somerset is, it's a place I know well. It was my first visit to the Far East last January. There were interesting client relations. We had to deal with, as you will know, huge media interest in a story that features iconic warplanes and buried treasure. Then there'll be an element of truth and legend, and then a little word about where we were. And at this point I should say that I am in some trepidation by having the other senior archaeologist and the senior geophysicist from the project sitting in the room. So if anything flies from the back and hits me, you'll know who to blame. So, as I said, this was just like my normal day job. Except it wasn't. Because this is not a python. This is the reincarnation of a Buddhist master in a temple at Pegu. Hence the begging bowl. This is what I mean about cultural sensitivities being somewhere different and having a slightly different set of parameters around your work than National Planning, whatever it is, Framework MPPF. Planning policy. So, it's not a normal day in the office. So what happened? Well, once upon a time, two men met in a pub. And one of them told a story about how he'd heard the legend of the buried Spitfires at the end of the runway at RAF Mingladon, which is now Yangon or Rangoon Airport. One of the people who heard that story was David Cundall, a Lincolnshire farmer and Spitfire enthusiast, a man who's been involved in digging up crashed aeroplanes in Britain and was enthused and inspired by this story. And the story goes that at the end of the war they were either too expensive to scrap, too difficult to take away back to India to decommission, or that they were burying them to dig them up later, and so they were buried at the end of the runway. We will come back to this story later. So, David is now a man with a plan, and over the past 12 years has been into the country several times carrying out exploratory works to no avail. However, in a meeting between our Prime Minister and the President of the Union of Myanmar. The project came up again. It was picked up on by Tracy Spade and Victor Kishley. Victor I will explain a little about later in a moment. And they announced that Wargaming, Victor's company, would fund the search for the Spitfires. Andy Brockman, who's here, picked up on this and wrote a piece for Heritage Daily saying, oh, we've heard this story an awful lot before. And Tracy had the good sense to say, maybe we want a critical friend on the project. Andy then assembled a team of 3 people, himself, me as the senior field archaeologist, and Rod Scott as field archaeologist working to me, but also because of his experience as an ammunition technical officer, as our safety man for the site. This is an airfield that is heavily bombed by the Japanese and then the Allies, and there's a good chance still that there are things with fins that will not do you any good buried at the end of the runway, and whatever else is buried there. So, I get my visa, and we do the 4 o'clock in the morning rendezvous at Heathrow with the biggest excess baggage bill I have ever seen for archaeological tools, film crew, and all manner of good things. There's David with a Spitfire, and the Telegraph, who Sunday Telegraph and Daily Telegraph, both fascinated by this story and followed it at some length. So there we are. That's the legend. And they're in crates, and allegedly they're greased and wrapped in tar paper, and they'll be perfectly preserved. That's the story. The elaborate version says that they were buried on the orders of Lord Mountbatten as the last Viceroy of India, of which the country was then part, so that the Karen rebels could exhume them later on and fly them in what they thought was an imminent civil war against the Burmans. I'm not going to expound on it. I should leave that one hanging with you at the moment, because I like that. It's a great story. And this image, these might be the Spitfires you'll see all day. This image, you will have seen if you followed this story at all. It appeared in all the media accounts, in the print and online press, saying, and here is one of those Spitfires, which would be fine. And this is a Spitfire in a crate. This is the size of the crate we're talking about. It's the size of an international shipping container. The wings are stowed down the sides, here, and here. The propellers travelling separately, crated up in the bottom, and there's the plane. Now, this is fine. This is a crated Spitfire. Brilliant. It's not in the Far East. Those guys are all wearing quite heavy boiler suits for a start. There's no evidence of tropical kit, and then very helpfully, there's a serial number down there, which is for a plane that was never in the Far East. And this photograph taken of itself looks magnificent, unless you look at the rest of the series, and then there's another one taken from the other end of the crate, looking across it with the Rock of Gibraltar in the background. Now, I've been to Gibraltar, and I've been to Burma, Myanmar, and they are not the same place. So why did Victor Kishley and Wargaming want to get involved? Those of you who have been watching your televisions recently may have seen the TV advert for World of Warplanes. This is an online game. It's free to play. And you start playing, and then, of course, you part with your money when you want to upgrade your plane to something better, because you keep getting shot down. That's the clever part of it. There is also World of Tanks, which is the original game, and World of Warships now as well. The games came about when Victor and his mates at the University of Minsk were playing online games for their own entertainment, and that's what became World of Tanks. When Victor said, hang on, this is great fun, I'm sure people would pay us money to do this. And there he is, on a tank. And the reason that they went with tanks first is, as Victor said, for you in Britain, the Spitfire is the iconic piece of materiel of World War II. For us in the former Soviet Union, it's the T-34 tank. And that's why it was World of Tanks for us, because if you think about Kursk and those sort of things, it's all big tank actions on the steppes. Very proudly, Tracy says, as the Director of Projects for Victor, history is in our DNA. They funded the lifting, or part of the lifting and conservation, of the Dornier from the Goodwin Sands, which is the rather colourful image here. They funded the Education Centre at Bovington at the Tank Museum and the Education Suite on the USS Iowa, the last surviving World War II proper big battleship, I think, in Los Angeles Harbour. So while you might be wondering whether the children are spending too long playing war games online, the money, some of it is going to good things. So there's Andy's article, Achtung Spitfires. The Achtung being the warning that one should take this legend of the buried treasure with some salt, if not more than a pinch, possibly. And it was Tracy who rang up and said, come on, get on board. The project was launched at the Imperial War Museum. Various assorted people there, including our geophysicists, David, Andy and Rod, our bomb man. And not in the picture there, Stanley Coombe, who was one of the sources of the story. Stanley came out east with us, was great company, was a fantastic source of stories, and in other cases a fantastic source of silence, because he would tell you about playing football for the divisional football match, or playing music for the divisional football match. He would tell you the story about when he saw the crates, but he would go very, very silent about telling you about anything else about his time in the Far East, which we all found incredibly telling. Stanley's version of the story is, I was driving up the old Prome Road in a lorry, and they were doing works to extend the runway. And this lad from the RAF stops us, and they do some work, and then lets us go again. And as I looked across to the left, I could see all these crates. Now the following day, I saw this bloke again, and I said to him, what's in them crates then, mate? And he said, would you believe, Spitfires. I heard Stanley tell me the story, or tell the story several times. That is Stanley's story. The works they're talking about are major rebuilds on the runway at Yangon. Oh yeah, and there's the reason we got to go. The PM having chats with the main man out there. It all gets a bit grey and green at this point, where maybe there are a bigger agenda at play than letting some people go out and have a nice time looking for aeroplanes in the sunshine when the rest of you were all digging your cars out of the snow in January. But get there we did. And there's our team. This is an interesting mixed team. You have people there from Wargaming. Gavin. You've got the field team. Andy, me, Rod's there somewhere. You have 3 people from doing geophysics, from the University of Leeds, from Imperial College, and you've got a film crew. Because the whole thing's being filmed for a documentary movie. You've also got Manny, who's our machine driver. He does work on the west coast of the States, doing infrastructure in incredibly busy city centres. So it's like being a machine driver here. You are good, because if you aren't good, it gets really expensive. I remember when we cut off Janet Street Porter's water, that was expensive, and an education. All sorts of words. That was a long time ago in Clerkenwell, and a long way away. Over here, you've got our local partners. STP, Shui Tao Po Enterprises, the Golden Mountain Company, local company run by Burmese businessman, who were fantastic. They did all the site works for us. They provided all our labour, all our by that I do not mean people digging holes. They were the technical labour, the site workers, the whole thing, as well as, yes, people to dig holes as well. Which raised issues of working in a foreign country. Things that you might get away with saying to a builder in this country, maybe we didn't want to, that would be classed as banter, maybe you don't say that to people in another culture. So we have to be aware of that. We have to be aware this is a different culture entirely. I take you back to our Python and our monk. And coming out of that was the fact that the entire landscape is regarded as sacred in Burmese tradition, at least according to the monk that we spoke to. So, in terms of standing respect, here's Tutu, who owns STP, and our local fixer, Auntie Lap, who is, and they've both got the umbrella man. There was only one meeting when I warranted an umbrella man, and it was having an umbrella was a definite signifier of status. I'm dangerously getting close to theoretical archaeology here, but that's what was going on. Andy there, you can see, explaining what's going on in our hole, and various other people from the company, and David in the background. So, standing, very important. Different to a client meeting in Britain. But the respect came back the other way. We were looked after magnificently, with shade, water, cold drinks, and the most magnificent on-site facilities that I have ever had. And these were constructed for us and were flushing, as well as being lovely. The Thunderboxes reference is for any of you who remember Tony Brewster in East Yorkshire, who was a fellow of this society. He told a magnificent story about Thunderboxes and the Soviet Union, and it's a word like voxel that he claims to have got into Russian. But there we are. So, but no, we were magnificently looked after, so it was a two-way process. But they were enormously proud, quite rightly so, being part of this project, and there we are, the Shui Tang core group of companies, Spitfire excavation on the edge of site. It's a bit different to your usual putting up some Harris fencing. And they were, of course, using it for magnificent PR value. And there's the Tutu Centre, David Cundall, you can see, giving the press conference about the Spitfire project to assembled local, by local I mean regional media, local in-country and from Singapore, China. China Daily turned up, all sorts of people. And our fixer, our local link, here in talking to me, explaining what's going on and why, at this point, she's explained to me why we can't dig yet. Even though JCB have provided us with two lovely machines, we have the bits of paper from the control tower, and it's all good to go, except it's not. Because this gentleman hasn't turned up yet. I've never done an excavation that needed a site blessing beforehand. When I asked why we were doing it, it sounds like why are we doing this? No, that's what the process was. I was told that the ground is sacred and the earth spirits were being informed by the monk that our work was in good faith and that we were doing the right thing and that this was not a malign project, which was fantastic, which was why when we were asked, well, if any of you would like to take part, I was happy to do that. It's your country, your rules. And I respect the ground enough that I would hope I'm living out of it for 20-something years. I respect the ground enough to be able to respect it like that as well. So that's where we are. We're on the ground. We're there. Great, we're going to dig holes. But you never turn up on a site and just start randomly digging holes. You always do your desk-based first. Now, Andy, who's here, and Rod, who isn't, did an awful lot of desk-based beforehand, and I had a bit of input to it as well. So let's just have a look at what the paper story was, the paper trail, because you need your historical context, You need to assess what's happened to the landscape between whenever what you're looking at happened and where we are today, whether it's Neolithic or 1945. You want to look at your potential targets to dig, otherwise you end up running willy-nilly around the edge of an airfield digging holes randomly. There are probable dead ends. There are potential hazards like, high voltage cables. And you want to know how you might proceed. There's the old military adage that the plan never survives first contact with the enemy, at which point you actually need to have some sort of plan for where you go next. So here we are. Well, the great thing about doing modern conflict archaeology is people take lots of air photographs, and here is one. The airfield here is in Japanese hands, but it is a classic RAF interwar airfield with that sort of triangular shape. You can see the road, the Chrome Road, running up here. You can see hangars and infrastructure and the runways. And if we were to zoom in, there is bomb damage. Because the Japanese bombed it, then when they take it, the Allies bomb it back. So there's potential. But at dead ends, you start seeing disturbed ground and thinking, that looks like a good place to dig, and you discover it's where a stick of bombs has landed. Maybe that's not somewhere to go looking. And it is some fantastic overlays. The modern runway for an international airport is at a different alignment. But what you can see on the 1945 image is that the end of the runway here is being extended, and there's all sorts of earthwork going on in this area. And the old Chrome Road stops and starts again. And when Stanley says they were doing something and they stopped us, that's why. It's because the road now runs out there. Runs around the end of the modern runway, and that's been there since 1945. And the reason that they extended the runway is because planes are getting bigger, not just military planes like the Super Fortress, but they know that the war will end, or indeed as works progress the war has ended, and big commercial airplanes are being developed. And so having a big long runway is the future, whether it's military or civil. The search area that's been narrowed down is, there's the road, well, sort of somewhere here. It's to the left of the road. And there are some areas where David said he thought looked promising. And there are some areas that in 2004 he had thought looked so promising that they were subject to some geophysical survey. But before we come to geophysics, what else did we look at? Well, cabinet papers. Because if this is the secret burial, the cabinet papers will talk about it. And funnily enough, they don't. Similarly, the secret reports, no, there's nothing there. But the command files for the Air Command Southeast Asia, AXIA, and the unit, that's unit, the individual unit, not unit from Doctor Who. Just in case anyone thinks it's taking a completely weird turn. The unit operation record books for the airfield and for squadrons. And none of them give you any evidence of any motive which leads to burial of Spitfires. So this idea that they were being buried for Karen rebels or buried so that the locals could dig them up and have their own air force or whatever, there is no evidence to back that up. Now, then we come to the problem of digging holes to bury crates of Spitfires. You've already seen how big one of those crated planes is. Now we are 40 feet by 10 feet by 5 feet. It's 2,000 cubic feet per crate. The numbers vary according to sources and legends of how many of these planes are buried. But let's take 16 as the conservative estimate. So we are talking about an awful lot of dirt. 213 hours work with a modern machine. What they are using is the Mark I person. This is a fantastic image, watercolour, made by Thomas Barclay Hennell. He was stationed out there, and he's sitting doing watercolours of the works at the runway. What we don't know is whether those people doing the work are local labour, or actually, given that they're all dressed the same and wearing trousers, we think they might actually be Japanese prisoners of war. Now, here's another flaw in the secret argument. Those people are a security risk. You cannot get them to sign the Official Secrets Act and expect them to keep quiet, because they are the captured, defeated enemy. So, there we are. Or if they're locals, as some of them may be, they're going to go home at night and tell everybody what they've been doing. No one seems to have said, oh, we were burying aeroplanes. But those are the works. There is a little bit of mechanical work using graders, which is the thing up here at the top, and bulldozers. Again, great for moving earth around to level out a new runway. Not great for trying to dig holes to bury huge numbers of aeroplanes, to dig holes the size I just talked about. So, evidence indicates, I never say never, it was impossible for greater Spitfires to be buried at the time. Now, were any Spitfires brought into country? No. There's various reasons we can say this. There's one of them. Strategic bombing, remarkably effective on the docks. I particularly like this chap from the Scots Regiment down here who's been told to guard this and must be standing there thinking, why? The reason why is that there is a huge shortage of timber in the country at the time, and you get a lot of signals traffic with people saying we're trying to rebuild the place and there isn't enough timber. So he's probably guarding it against people coming and nicking the buildings to rebuild their own bits of downtown Rangoon. So that's one reason. The docks are knackered. But we have the shipping returns. No one mentions Spitfires, but somewhere on here they mention Osters. Osters are little spotter planes. They come in crates the same as Spitfires. Spitfires, not a lot of use unless you're actually doing aerial combat. Osters, however, in a country which has had its infrastructure wrecked by sabotage and bombing, are fantastic because they are short takeoff and landing aircraft, high-wing artillery spotters. Originally, you can ping them out, go to a location, drop your district officer in or your military governor, and they help you re-establish control in your colony. However short-lived that is going to be, you are going to do that. So these things are brilliant. There's a lot of them come in. So, we don't think we've got burials. We think we have got planes and crates being brought in, but not Spitfires. But this is all good hypothesis. What happens when we dig holes? Because this is all very nice. It's all suggestive. But there's no solid evidence from the ground. What I think someone who has stood here before a long time before me said, the testimony of the spade. Oh, you can tell him I put a flattering photo of him up. This is our senior geophysicist with one of the, I promised you pagodas. There's a pagoda in the background. The box behind him is not geophysical equipment, it's part of the landing lights for the airfield. So when I talk about high voltage cabling, I really do mean cabling, and it really is important because if we dug a hole in the wrong place and taken that out, we'd have been really unpopular, and I probably would still be there now. I have to say I'm amazed. I think this is what having prime ministerial backing does for you. I cannot imagine that an archaeological team would be given quite such free rein as we were there had we turned up at Gatwick. I mean, don't get me wrong, safety procedures were magnificent and stringent and everything, but digging a hole on the edge of an international runway seemed, well, I don't know, it was good for them, because it's all about the ground truthing. So, the geophysics, the first element of this. There's our survey grid from 2004. That's what it found. You might have seen this image. This image was oft quoted, along with the picture of the plane in the box, because people were looking at that and sometimes willfully misinterpreting those distances, 50-metre distance, as being a buried plane, because it looks a bit like one. But equally, they were saying, oh, maybe these are the trenches with the planes in, and they're giving you this strong reading because of either the metal in the aeroplanes or the voiding in the crates or whatever. So there's a lot of credence attached to this image, which is a fantastic bit of geophysics. But everything is always down to interpretation, and the interpretations that were being quoted were not necessarily based on an understanding of what happens when you stick currents through the ground. So they're the famous bits. So 2013, take the team out, go out, resurvey that area, and survey some new areas that equally look promising, and throw every technique that we could get on the plane at it. So everything measured in using global positioning system, magnetometry, ERT, which is not something that we normally use for archaeological surveys, not the sort of thing you see them use on time team very often. It takes a lot longer than wandering about with magnetometry, but the results are deeper and more detailed. And there's our extension with those lights, and something coming through here which looks very interesting. Nice high resistance reading, yeah, I don't know what that is. That's our 2000 grid again. And there's some of the data. Now, interestingly, that grid's got nothing much happening on it, even though there's a lot of stuff happening in there. And that's not consistent with there being a big hole full of exciting stuff. It's mixed soils. Anyway, we all sat round, we talked to geophysics, and they said, yeah, well, the resurvey suggests that the 2004 site has been disturbed, but it's worth having a look at to confirm that. And the 2013 area, the new area, well, that's got a big oblique anomaly running across it, and that's got to be worth looking at, because if it's the prone road, it might help. So, Roger's caveats. Geophysics is not a Spitfire detector. It can exclude the possibility of buried aircraft, like if you're not getting any signals consistent with that, then that's a fairly good indicator they're in there. And it could offer necessary but not sufficient evidence of buried planes, which is where digging holes come in. Oh yes, that's I'll tell you that story later if we have time, but that is what one looks like. But that signal from a plane in a box could equally be provided by scrap or by this stuff. Pierced steel planking, which is used for temporary roads and runways in the 40s and 50s, and is now used, if you go to Yangon, everywhere as fencing. That's a fantastic piece of conflict archaeology. It's the renegotiation of materiel, as Nick Saunders would say, where something military has been turned into a very domestic piece of fencing material. Loads of it. So, there we are, we're poised, we're waiting. Are we going to get to do any work? Well, we've got to have our permits, our licences, we've got to deal with the local bureaucracy about working on the airfield. There may be issues with it being an emerging democracy, although actually they seem to be remarkably limited. There were security issues, as I was very pleased to see. You know, I was flying in and out of that airfield. I wanted to know that we were safe. We were. There were some language differences, and there, of course, are safe working practices. Safe working on the edge of an airfield, which is active, are not health and safety gone mad. They're about me being able to stand here and talk to you today. So there we are, being booked in and out by paramilitary police. That's all good. Our STP guys, who are our site managers, responsible for health and safety. Chap on the far side had done a lot of work in Singapore, and they worked to British Health and Safety Executive Standards, so we could speak the same language. That was fantastic for me. It was really helpful, where we both there was a lot of discussion about safety, and me and him went on one side, and I said, right, this is how we do it. How do you do it? He went, yep, that's the same. End of problem. All good. But some of us were quite surprised by the Myanmar safety boots. Especially when you know how sharp those mattocks are. I was very pleased to see, though, that they're actually good with them, because all the digging team all had their own toes. Didn't appear to have anybody else's either. But these guys were great, and they moved a lot of dirt and were really helpful, because frankly, they are much more used to working in that climate than I am, and as they kept pointing out to me. But it's winter. It's not hot, it's winter. So, my role specifically within this was to record, report, and monitor. I wasn't field director. It was Andy's job. There's a nuance here that we can go into about this later on if you wish. But my job was to make sure the client was happy, as David was saying, this is where we're thinking of digging. Are you happy with that? That sort of thing. And to make sure that everything was working as it should, and that anything was found was recorded to appropriate Institute for Archaeologists standards. Rod, you can see in the background, he's acting as banksman for me at this point, and he's also acting as lookout for bombs, just in case. And there we are. There's Manny doing his thing with the bucket. He was one of those drivers that I trusted to be that close to the bucket when it came down. You know, if he can put the bucket that far in front of your toes consistently, he's good. We like him. And when you say I want that much off and that much comes off, oh yeah. So we dug a big hole in the area of the 2004 geophysics where the big anomaly was, and we found that the trench actually at its maximum depth goes to 9 feet, 3 metres. You can see that's 2 metres. The 3 metre bit we didn't go in because frankly it was unsafe, and the reason it was unsafe is that this lovely red soil that you can see overlying a blue clay deposit at the bottom, this lovely red soil is very loose and very friable and consistent with having been recently disturbed. Also consistent with that were the random objects that we found. The brick ends, the bits of PSP, centre, and, closest to us, these big structural timbers. And there were several of those, but none of them together. There was just this dump of spoil with things in it. And I think at one point a plastic bag. Now that plastic bag ain't 1945. So it's a bit of an indicator that that had been disturbed within what we could call the plastic age. And there we are, there's one of the timbers being recovered. Local people doing the work while I stand there panting and thinking, my God, it's hot. There are pictures of me doing work elsewhere. That was one of Rod's pictures, he delighted in taking pictures of me not doing it. We also found this, which is remnants of part of the old airfield infrastructure from the RAF rebuild. So there's not going to be any planes under there. There's only planes in Area 1, because that ground has been disturbed recently down to blue clay, to geology, naturally. There's nothing in there. There's nothing in this area, because that's got 1945 runway on top of it. And frankly, you are not building runway and taxiway over a hole with boxes of aeroplanes in because of the structural instability. However, we did some more trenches. You can see how high the water table is here. That's an interesting thing to think about in terms of preserving planes made out of metals. But this trench had the most interesting archaeology in it. Now, if you've been to some of these talks, you've seen people talking about Stonehenge and pyramids and whatever. This is not in the same league, I'll just warn you now. But it's from the point of view of where we were and what we were doing, this is the good stuff. That is the beaten earth road surface, resurfaced and dug out and with chippings and soil in it of the old prone road. So hence not quite the road to Mandalay. At the side of the road, and the road itself is over here, there was a ditch, roadside ditch. That's fine, you think that's a roadside ditch. Nothing unusual about that. Except for the fact that this had within it very distinct blobs of fill, as its rough profile. And those distinct blobs of fill are all about the same size as a sandbag. Now, in my introduction, you were made aware of my work in Belgium, looking at First World War battlefields. Now, it is exactly the same image here I could have shown you from Belgium, where at the end of the war, they refill a trench by kicking the sandbags back into the hole. And I probably do mean kicking, because, you know, this is what squaddies we're talking about. This is consistent with that. You get primary fill as the sides erode, and then the parapets are pushed or thrown back in. So this roadside ditch probably begins life, yes, as a roadside ditch. During the war, it is turned into a shelter trench. Now that road, as you saw, runs across the end of the runway in a very open piece of ground. And fascinatingly, when you stood in the middle of the runway, or the airfield there, you looked one way, you saw the great pagoda at Schwedegon. You look the other way and there's another great pagoda, and they're on a perfect axis either end of the runway, which means that if you're in your Beaufighter and you're lining up for your bombing run, you've got a perfect line of sight straight down that runway to go and carve up the Japanese aeroplanes or their lorries moving up and down the road. And I think that's what's going on here. Whether it's the British doing it before the Japanese arrive and the Japanese carry on doing it, or the Japanese doing it themselves, I do not know. But what someone has done is turned this road, side ditch, into a shelter trench, so that if you are being shot up, you can jump out of your lorry or dive off the side of the road if it's a column of troops into some sort of safety. It would also provide close defence for the end of the runway if it came to a hand-to-hand fight. Conflict archaeology. Why did we go there? Well, why were we monitoring and recording? That's not Spitfires. No, it's not. But that's the archaeology of the conflict in Burma during the Second World War. There's loads of it, yes. Lots of it's in the jungle and very exciting, and there are crashed planes and burnt out tanks and all manner of things. This is accessible, it's there, and it gives us a little glimpse into a moment of history that otherwise would have been dug straight through, and they were saying, well, dig a bit more and see if the Spitfires are there. It's not. That is an important part of the story of human experience in the Second World War. And I don't care which side digs it, because both sides are being shot at. And I think time has gone by long enough now that both sides are being shot at, and that's more than I would want. However, what happens next? Well, there's a gap. We've done some digging, then there's a gap in proceedings while we're waiting for a permit from the Ministry of Transport. And Rod and I and Andy are in our hotel room and we're bored. And we think we ought to be doing some work. What should we do? I know, let's go back through all that historical documentation again and tie it into what we've seen and to the conversations we've now had with David and with Stanley out here. And hence the police whiteboard, because Rod has worked with a lot of coppers and knows how these work. And Andy and I have read a lot of crime fiction and we think we know how they work. So, Keith Park, Commander South East Asia Air Forces. Supplement to the London Gazette, 1951. During the months of May to August, the repair and salvage units returned to service 830 aircraft and dismantled a further 420, which had been written off, dismantled. Not buried, not pushed off the back of aircraft carriers into the South China Sea, dismantled. This fantastic thing, this document, it talks about the last paragraph. The aircraft scrap was being put to good account. Local cottage industries were making cooking utensils and many other articles which were in short supply in Burma. You will know that aluminium pots and pans were buried ostensibly to create Spitfires. And here we see the process working back the other way, where presumably the Japanese had had all the metal off the locals, and so this is a source of replenishment. Swords into plowshares. Sadly, I was hoping that at some point you'd see somebody cooking street food on something with an RAF Ramble still on the side. So, CSI Yangon. We took the history, we looked at the archaeology, and we had a little think about the legends as well. And there is no evidence of Spitfires at RAF Mingladon. The unserviceable Spitfires were scrapped. What there are on the airfield, there are those crates of Osters, because we know some of them arrive and then they're shipped out to Singapore. Now that suggests that they are not taken out of the crates, because once you take them out of the crate, you've got to start servicing them and they become an asset. Well, they're in the box, they're just a problem for stores, they're just there. So, crates of aeroplanes sitting on the side of the runway, fine. Probably are Osters. Burying them? Well, you've seen the scale of the earthworks from those watercolours. Where does the legend come from? Boards, well I said board soldiers, board servicemen. Better than board servicemen, in Stanley's case, board servicemen with an opportunity to wind up somebody from the other service. The military are tribal. If they're not fighting somebody else, they will be fighting each other. And this is a young aircraftsman who gets asked by a young squaddy what's in them boxes. And he decides to spin him a yarn. It is Schrodinger's Spitfire. I like an audience like this where you can crack that gag and they get it. So, the RAF don't really have the means to do it. They certainly don't have the motive. And that's why. Technical difficulties, shortage of labour, no heavy machinery. The planes are all cut up and sold to the locals. What there will be somewhere is a big pit full of all the things the locals didn't want, like the radioactive dials from the altimeter and stuff. But we didn't find that. That's what I would have liked to have found. So, there we are. The archaeological evidence entirely supports the desk-based assessment. However, there are conflict archaeology remains. You see them on the air photos. We saw that trench on the ground. And potentially, those big timbers are the remains of something like an air raid shelter. But because that ground is disturbed, we will never know. Yeah, then the story got out that we'd been sitting in a hotel room saying we didn't believe that the planes were there. Adam Lusher, probably pretty obvious which one's Adam, from the Sunday Telegraph, was actually friendly forces as far as the media went. But we were at one point warned not to go into the hotel bar because we would be the only people in there, not journalists, and they would descend on us and attempt to buy us drinks, get us drunk, and get us to reveal all our secrets. Yeah. Anyway. So once upon a time, people love telling war stories. If you've worked with anyone who's been in the military, they will tell you all manner of war stories. They won't be about war, they'll be about firing tins of jam out of howitzers and all manner of stupid things. You've got the exotic location. The inaccessibility of the site. To check, it's an airfield. It's in a country that has been inaccessible through sanctions for many years. Oh, there's our love of quests and treasure. And then there are Spitfires, those beautiful, iconic aircraft that, if you believe the legend, saved Britain. There's been no critical analysis over 70 years of people telling the story of, I was told they buried Spitfires. I've never met anyone who said, I saw or I buried. They're always, they do say, effectively. So we have a very plausible legend. That's why it becomes true. Now, The quest story is universal, we know that. The buried treasure story is universal. And in fact, the story of buried military materiel has a pedigree going back at least to the Crimean War. Because I found an account in the folklore of Surrey, and Jacqueline Simpson, who was president of the Folklore Society, one of our sister societies, where she said she'd found accounts of treacle mines. And the treacle mines were caused... Treacle mines, if you know these, you get them on various landscapes, Surrey Heath, and then these black, splodgy solution hulls that look like black treacle or molasses. And the local story there is that the treacle was in barrels buried by the guards after their inspection by Queen Victoria and before their embarkation to the Crimea. So that's 100 years nearly before our Spitfires at Mingledon. Why you would bury all your molasses before going to the Crimea when we know there's a supply shortage is beyond me. But there is the pedigree for our legend. People like a mystery, people like a conspiracy theory. Oh, and somewhere in this there is truth, because after I came back from this job, I went and had a look at some holes at the end of the runway at RAF Uphaven. And they had World War II things buried in them. Number plates and spanners. The number plates were all from RAF military vehicles, and they'd been striking them off charge and decommissioning them as military vehicles by taking off the number plates, presumably piling them up somewhere, and then when the sergeant said, "Get them out of my hangar," the obvious thing to do was stick them in a hole. The spanners were great big ones for servicing Dakotas, which they used to fly out of the airfield, and of course, end of the war, planes all go away, no need for loads of big spanners. But there is some truth in buried stuff. The other one is, usually it's where the chemical weapons dump is, so if any of you are thinking of going looking for buried treasure, wear your rubber gloves. So, White Elephant? Flight of Fancy? We went at a fascinating time. If you watch BBC television the other evening, you will have seen the Wildlife of Burma series start, and people are opening the place up and going in there, and our hotel had tour parties in it. It is the great opening market. It has its small populations. It's massively wealthy in terms of natural resources. That is why, before we went, we had a very good warm-up man. So yes, the iconic photograph of the lady and the president. But that's why Obama's there. It's not to celebrate her being out of house arrest. It's because of the commercial opportunities that the country presents. And that's potentially why Mr. Cameron was so keen to support us, because it was, and why the embassy were fantastic. Because it was a way of making more links through side channels with the government. The country is, in the developing world, but it is, as you can see, fascinating and beautiful. That's dawn at the Shwedagon Pagoda in the centre of Yangon. The small blob is a monk, just for scale. If you book on one of these, I was looking at tour packages idly in the Sunday Supplement the other day, and they say, see the sunset at Shwedagon, see the sunrise, see the dawn come up like thunder, the lights go on as the sun rises, it's magnificent. The chanting, the incense, the whole thing, it's sensory. You can see why Kipling's subjects, his soldiers, were so taken by the place, and where Kipling was himself. It's a fantastic, strange introduction to the Far East, if you haven't been, as I hadn't. And its culture and its archaeology are magnificent, as you see. And as you see. That's great, it's a fantastic piece of Victorian industrial archaeology. Oh, by the way, there's a huge statue, which So you always take your own perceptions there. No, and the statue is magnificent and glorious. But what I particularly liked here was the archaeology of imperialism, because this is the British Empire, Burma as part of the Raj, and the locals saying we want to protect our statue from the elements, and so they're building a railway station over it for them, because that's how we span big spaces in 1860. It's great. And it's an Indian and Scottish engineer that are named on the little plaque there. And was it worth it? Well, yes it was, because that legend has been kicking around for a long time. Before David's involvement, before any of our involvement. I'm sure that legend will carry on being told. But maybe we injected a bit of reality check, a bit of a reality check into the proceedings. Maybe we put a bit of academic rigour on the legend. It's the same way as Nick Hyam does all sorts of things about King Arthur and says, and people still believe it's a bloke in shining armour. But actually, at the end of the day, was it worth it? Yes, because we did our little bit to remind people about people who, at the time, called themselves the Forgotten Army, 14th Army in Burma. We did our bit to remember the stories not only of people from Britain, New Zealand, Australia who fought in Burma, but Indians, Burmese, West African regiments, all commemorated on this monument that you see before you. And, as I mentioned with our trench, our Japanese forces as well, because I'm trying not to use the word victims, they're victims of history as much as anyone else. But you know what I mean. So was it worth it? Yeah. We're telling a story about a country that people don't know very well. We're telling a story about a piece of British history that people don't know very well. And we're saying there's a lot of people there whose story deserves to be better known. So, thank you, and thank you very much.
Ended not in discovering and finding something, but in, I suppose, basically debunking a myth. And also an insight into a country which is very, very unknown to the West, and as you say, is being opened up. We have got time for one or two questions, if anybody would like to ask some questions. No? Yes?
Most of the charts you were showing about the import of aeroplane, surely you could have done all of that from home or through an internet or whatever without having to go there.
Yes. No. Yes, we could. Yes. But there is always that chance. And frankly, we were seeing Adam's geophysics results from 2004. We were getting various versions of the story, and yes, you can say, well, and there's always at the bottom of it, there's this, but they're very good in secret. How do you deal with that? The only way you can deal with it is to go there and dig holes. I realise that's terribly disappointing for us all, realising it's going to go to the sunshine in January. But no, seriously, actually, there comes a point when it is only by digging the holes will you get to the bottom of the story.
I had a question. I just wondered, you showed a photograph of Stanley, one of the veterans, and I just wondered how it was received both by him and other veterans that this actually wasn't true, it was a myth.
He was very good about it, actually, and there was an element of, well, I've wondered all these years, and if that's the way it goes, that's sort of the way it goes. And I think there'd always been part of him that had thought, oh come on, you know, it's got it, and treated it with some caution. But yeah, I mean, he was as disappointed as the rest of us. I would have loved to have been standing in that film because of the great So yeah, our other great source sadly died, so we weren't able to get sort of as much reaction from him as we would have liked from Morris. But otherwise, we haven't. I don't know. Andy, have you had anything from anyone else? Any other veterans about who'd heard the story or not?
Not really. I mean, there's been some press coverage of veterans coming forward as a result of the coverage of our expedition, whereby people, it's largely people saying, actually, I knew it couldn't be true because I was there and I never heard anything, I never saw anything.
Yes, which is consistent with what Maurice Short said, wasn't it? Of this, I was there, I never heard anything. I don't think.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So rather than what you say about Stanley, I echo that. As well as that, Stanley's a fabulous guy and was great, as you say, great company, and a great source for us. And he was absolutely open about what he actually saw as opposed to what people were actually saying.
Yes, I think that's, over the course of the years there have been an element of several witnesses that had words put into their mouths would be the wrong way of putting it. I think there have been interpretations put on some of their statements and embellishments that took it beyond where they may have actually been. So.
On the question of mythology of history, I remember talking to a man who was a Southeast Asia combatant during the Second War. I don't say it was Burma, but I'm not sure. And he said he used to go to the regimental reunions every year. They got smaller and smaller, but when they were very big in the 60s. And he said it's remarkable that people would come along to these who weren't actually there and would claim they were. They would mention people they'd met in the mess on the battlefield, and people who were there would say, oh yes, I remember him, he was a jolly good chap, you know, blah, blah, blah. And I was in the United States, Michigan, and talking about this to somebody, and a man came along and said, oh yes, a lot of the Vietnamese War veterans, a very tight-knit crowd, they're very cautious about it all, have these reunions in which people who were not there claim they were, and others claim they remember them. And so the mythology does really grow in people's minds, and they believe it.
Yes, thank you for that. That's fascinating, actually.
Susan, did you have a question?
Well, really, it was just to sort of put a little defence on for actually going to look when you're not sure. Thinking about the evidence from Inch Tootle, the abandoned Roman fort beyond the line. You wouldn't expect to go there and find how many, was it 2 or 3 tons of nails that had been war material that had been buried before they abandoned the fort, and yet they did it. And if someone had said, oh, this story, they buried 3 tons of nails up there, iron nails, which are valuable, I don't think I thought it was nonsense, but they were there.
Yes, I must say, Inch Tootle is the case where it's real. Where there really is stuff buried at the end of, well, not the runway, but you get my point. Yeah.
Okay, well, thank you very much, Martin. That was absolutely fascinating. And thank you to everybody for coming. There are some more lectures in our series. There's a programme outside which you're welcome to pick up. The next lecture, which is on the 28th of January, is on something completely different. And one of the things about this public lecture programme is it shows the breadth and depth and the wide range of interest that the Society of Antiquaries and its fellows have. The next lecture is by Robert Hutchinson, who is a fellow of the Society and also has written, I think he's written some novels. Anyway, it's called Mad, Bad and Dangerous to Know, the Medical History of Henry VIII. So it's a very, very different topic whatsoever. So thank you very much, everybody. Thank you to Martin.